public participation folks as attendees. So we're all here tonight to learn more about a proposal being made by Corey Johnson to be president of the City Council. And on behalf of the council member to make the presentation, oh, the boxes keep moving around. I'm sorry. So we have Annie Levers, who will be speaking to us about the proposals. And we also have Paul Graziano. You're looking where Paul's there. They're as one of the presenters as well tonight, who will also be informing us as to different things about the program for tonight. And following the conclusion of the information that we're going to learn from our two presenters, members of the board who are here, as well as the committee, zoning committee, will be and other invited guests will be entitled to ask questions of our presenters. We will ask that you wait until we have both presenters who have spoken, so to have the questions that anybody has. And at the conclusion, we'll have the zoning committee vote with regard to a motion with regard to the presentation that we're going to hear tonight. And that's how we're setting it out. If there are members from the public who have issues or questions, we do have an active chat, and you can post questions there. And any member of the committee who is so inclined can read through those questions that are in the chat. They're available to everyone. And if you are on the committee and you want to ask any of those questions that are raised by members of the public, feel free to do so. But from the members of the public who are here tonight, it's more or less to observe our committee in its works. So that being the case, I turn the meeting over to our presentation on behalf of the Planning Together, Annie Levers.
Thank you for having me here tonight. I really appreciate it. I did want to make one request, though, just to the format that you just described. I would like an opportunity to answer questions directly after my presentation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the presentation and proposal is going to describe. And so I just want to make sure that everyone has accurate information from the speaker's office before moving on to the next phase of the discussion. No. Is that okay?
Well, I don't have an issue with having members of the committee ask questions directly to you at the conclusion of your presentation. I think people would be more informed if they wait until they hear both sides of the issue. But certainly if there are any direct questions related to something that you bring up during the presentation, that's perfectly okay.
Okay. I would prefer for that to occur, just to remind folks that this presentation is from the New York City Council, and so we are the best positioned to answer questions accurately about the information we're going to present here tonight. So I just want to make that clear before we're getting started. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Everyone can see my presentation and hear me all right?
Yep.
Great. So a huge thanks to having me here tonight. I really appreciate it. My name is Annie Levers. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for the Office of Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Council. Our division spearheaded this Planning Together report and legislative proposal that I will be presenting here tonight. This is a bill that's been introduced in the council and will go through the legislative and public hearing process. That includes a public hearing that will be scheduled likely in the next, several months, and then the council will take further input and move the proposal through the legislative process. It is not like a ULURP application. It does not have a specific clock attached to it. So I just wanted to make that very clear and move on with my presentation from there. So I know there's a lot of experience in this room. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide with respect to key issues, but will instead sort of run through the key issues that we identify in the report, which I, again, direct folks to continue to use as a resource. There's a lot of really great research and resources in that report. But for tonight, in short, the city's planning mandates are insufficient, they're scattered, and they're confusing. This leads to a lot of inefficiencies and a lack of coordination between city agencies. Our planning regime is purely reactionary. So there are very few meaningful opportunities for all communities across the city to proactively plan for their futures. Some neighborhoods have gotten really good planning attention over the last few decades, while others have been completely neglected, left with a 1961 zoning resolution that supports out-of-context development. The city's piecemeal project-by-project approach to rezonings has exacerbated inequality, and the budget is rarely, if ever, connected to our policy or land use priorities in any meaningful way. The sort of piecemeal reactionary approach has supported an uneven landscape across the city. Like I said, where some neighborhoods are getting fine-grained contextual rezoning tools that work really well, and others are left with decades-old zoning resolutions that really do not speak to their built environment or needs. And as our budget decisions are almost entirely divorced from our assessments of capital needs, which are also totally insufficient. So in response to these issues, the council started working on a proposal for comprehensive planning under the direction of Speaker Johnson during the 2019 Charter Revision Commission process. And the speaker was supportive of implementing comprehensive planning through that process at the time. And when the commission did not take up the issue, the council continued developing a version of the proposal that could be adopted by the council via local law. The proposal that I'll describe here today is designed specifically to center issues of equity, sustainability, and resilience within the full range of policy, budget, and land use tools to force coordination across city agencies to better achieve our citywide and neighborhood goals. Comprehensive planning is extremely common, so that's just the first thing to know. New York City is a complete outlier in its lack of comprehensive plan. Every other major city in the country engages in some form of comprehensive planning, but for decades, New York City has repeatedly abandoned attempts to require comp planning in favor of this ad hoc approach, despite the fact that comprehensive planning is widely accepted as the best practice for confronting the climate crisis specifically and integrating sustainability into all aspects of urban governance. Before I get started on describing the proposal, I wanted to do a quick fact check and describe what the proposal does and does not do, just to clear the air. The bill does not make nor require any amendments or changes to the city's zoning resolution whatsoever. It does not require or trigger requirements for any kinds of rezonings, let alone upzonings, ever. It does not propose or support the elimination of single-family zoning in New York City, nor does it propose any specific rezoning actions whatsoever. It does not amend or eliminate community boards' role in future rezoning processes, all of which would remain subject to ULURP. So that's just a fact check. These are facts about the legislation. I know it's a pretty complicated bill, but I just wanted to clear that up. What the bill does intend to do is require the city to provide community boards and the public with new resources, data, and analyses to support proactive community-based planning on an ongoing basis. It does encourage the city to direct new growth or development away from low-lying areas vulnerable to sea level rise and other displacement risks, but does not again require any rezonings to actually fulfill that goal. It does identify and prioritize communities' urgent budget needs, regardless of whether or not those neighborhoods will be rezoned, which is a piece that's desperately missing from our current planning regime. A lot of neighborhoods feel like in order to get the investment needs that they need and have needed for many decades, they need to go through a rezoning for upzoning or MIH. This seeks to correct that issue and really identify budget needs from the get-go, regardless of whether or not the neighborhood will be rezoned, and then prioritize those needs in future budget decisions. And it does encourage fine-grained rezoning tools that were found effective in other neighborhoods to be more equitably distributed citywide, and really gives neighborhoods the opportunity to proactively plan for their futures. So now I'll go into detail about how it approached each of these goals and really does work. So the comprehensive planning framework is designed to be a shared, proactive vision for the city's future across community stakeholders, city agencies, elected officials, and the New Yorkers those elected officials represent. The comprehensive plan itself would be informed by all of these various inputs. Principles of equity and justice to correct existing and historic neighborhood disparities and ensure equitable distribution of resources and development moving forward. Climate and displacement risks would inform the final long-term plan facing our city as a whole, and especially for the neighborhoods already bearing the impacts of climate change today. Community input to lift up, preserve, and enhance what communities love about their neighborhoods and prioritize their vision for change, all while meeting citywide goals. Measurable targets for jobs, resiliency, infrastructure, open space, transportation, arts and culture, public health, all the good stuff that we need to fit in our city in order to support thriving neighborhoods over the next 20 years. A robust physical needs assessment would inform those citywide goals, examining really for the first time ever all of the city's existing infrastructure and repair needs, and the urgency of those repair needs across our neighborhoods, identifying serious disparities. And then finally, neighborhood history, including an examination of the impact of recent development and recent rezonings on our neighborhoods to assess whether or not the city's on-the-ground development decisions are really achieving their intended long-term policy goals. And last but not least, neighborhood needs. What are the budget needs of our communities as they stand right now, regardless of whether or not we expect those neighborhoods to grow or change over time, so that we can prioritize those first and foremost in the city's budget and planning process. These are standard and common features that comprehensive plans, again, that are used by every other city except for New York, all around the world, that they use to inform their process. And we've explicitly built specific ones that we found to be effective and applicable to New York City's context into the legislation. In designing the framework, our first task was to streamline and meaningfully connect the dozens of reports and plans and documents that are already required by the city charter, while we strengthen and create new resources for communities to use as they proactively plan. So all of the documents on the left exist and could together be conceived of as a comprehensive plan of some kind, but the charter fails to make clear whether or how they relate to one another. On the right, you'll see a depiction of the new cycle, which would connect all of these disjointed documents, processes, and reports required by the charter to create a citywide strategic vision. And this starts with community boards' district needs statements, which the charter will now make clear should directly inform the city's budget planning processes. The DNS would then inform the production of a new conditions of the city report, which would then feed into the citywide policies and goals, which would then inform the city's long-term plan, and ultimately our budget decisions. So each document would build on the last. Now I'll walk you through the planning process itself and how key stakeholders fit into and inform that process. So the framework is designed to create clear opportunities for neighborhoods and communities to proactively plan for their futures, to look, so that they can formulate a plan for what they want their neighborhood to look like, instead of just reacting to irresponsible as-of-right development or rezoning proposals that are already fully baked by the time they reach the community board. Excuse me, I've been talking all day. So the bill provides the outline of what would become the comp plan's public engagement process, which would be designed to lay a solid foundation for good proactive community-based planning work to get done by setting clear timelines and milestones and well-defined roles for each of the stakeholders you see on the slide that would be built on and adapted over the course of many decades. In designing this process, it was important for us to provide opportunities for members of the general public to comment on the proposal directly. And community boards and borough presidents would play an ongoing role during the 10-year planning cycle and would adopt recommended land use scenarios, which would then come to the council for review and adoption, just as 197A plans do now. These frameworks would essentially set the vision for what any potential future land use applications would get measured against. Again, community boards would play the same exact role they do right now in the ULURP process, just with all of these additional resources to inform their decisions and recommendations to the council. The Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability would then be the coordinating office working with city agencies to produce the analyses and public-facing documents. And a new long-term planning steering committee and borough steering committees would subsume an existing steering committee that oversees the Plan YC report right now, which is also required by the charter, and they would help set citywide goals. They would also play an ongoing oversight role to oversee the implementation of the plan and planning process, and then the actual recommendations in the plan. The CPC would play an ongoing role in their review and certification of ULURP applications exactly as they do now, but they would be required to measure those applications against the long-term plan. They would not be required to fulfill the goals or recommendations in the plan. They would just be required to consider whether or not the application aligns or conflicts with the recommendations of the long-term plan. So now I'll walk you through the process from start to finish. We've tasked the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, the Office of OLTPS, to be responsible for coordinating across city agencies to get this planning work done. The city's first task would be the production of a first of its kind conditions of the city report in coordination with communities and city agencies. This would include the revival of the zoning and planning report. It's the only thing in the city charter that has ever actually required the city to regularly review our city's zoning code and make recommendations for where to apply new fine-grained zoning tools that worked well in one neighborhood in other parts of the city with similar conditions. This report would also take all of the data that currently sits across dozens of reports and plans and the open data portal and put that data in one easy to use place. It would also require new analyses, including a physical needs assessment to assess the state of our current infrastructure for the first time in a comprehensive fashion, in addition to 2 new indices that Seattle uses to measure access to opportunity and displacement risk. The city would then work in partnership with communities and key stakeholders to determine the city's long-term needs for housing, jobs, open space, schools, and other critical infrastructure. And then through a robust public engagement process, New Yorkers would help decide where and how the city will distribute that critical infrastructure in their neighborhoods over the next 10 years, prioritizing any new projected growth in areas with high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement, which again is defined to include climate risks as well as rent and displacement risks. Community boards, borough presidents would adopt preferred land use scenarios for each of their relevant community districts. And this is an area where I've seen a lot of misinformation as well. Folks are saying that the community boards would be forced to pick among 3 scenarios that the city produces. That is not at all the case. The legislation simply states that community boards should adopt a preferred land use scenario, as does the council. So really it opens up the door for community boards to propose scenarios of their very own, which would then get sent to the council for consideration. The 3 produced by the city would just be resources, essentially, to force the city's hand to really provide some proactive planning resources to communities who would like to sort of envision different scenarios based on the resources the city provides, and then take that and produce scenarios of their own if they so see fit. The New York City Council would ultimately be responsible for, all those recommendations would get sent to the council, which would then be responsible for reconciling recommendations from various stakeholders and adopting a final preferred land use map for inclusion in the final long-term plan. Then those would set the vision for our neighborhoods, and we would measure future rezoning applications against those plans. ULURPs would be required to include a statement of alignment that describes how the action does or does not align with the plan, but those ULURP applications would not be required to comply with the plan. It would just require the statement of consideration. This would actually introduce a new model for better ensuring that community plans, especially 197A plans, are actually implemented and adopted into the zoning code. So it's a mechanism that's really missing from that prior effort around 197A plans, which are often ignored in rezoning decisions completely. So this statement of alignment would really force the CPC to explain themselves when they're certifying applications that conflict with the plan or describe why they made that decision, which would then inform community boards' recommendations to the council, which would play the same role in the ULURP process. Community boards would still participate in the ULURP process as they do now, but with these new resources, which would inform their decision-making processes and recommendations to the council. So the production of the plan would take place over the course of 4 years, from the appointment of the steering committee to the adoption of the final long-term plan. The graphic on the left outlines the points at which the bill will require public meetings, adoption of formal recommendations, and council adoption. We essentially required some form of public engagement before and after the production of each formal document in the planning process, from the conditions of the city report to the final long-term plan. These are intended to be viewed as baseline minimum requirements for participation that are required by law. They will provide important milestones for the purpose of public transparency, but are also designed to give the framework sufficient flexibility to grow and be adapted over time. So this depicts the full 10-year process, including when each document would be produced and the update amendment process, which would start halfway through the planning process. After the first cycle, the cycle starts over again, and each plan would build on the next. Compliance with the long-term plan would be encouraged and considered, but not explicitly required. All rezoning actions in furtherance of the plan or not would still be subject to ULURP. Future ULURP applications would be required to include a statement of alignment describing how the rezoning does or does not align with the final long-term plan. And community boards would entirely retain their role in the ULURP process with new data and resources assessing neighborhood needs to help inform decision-making processes. So we believe that this process holds a lot of opportunity for the city as a whole and individual neighborhoods, including yours, laying the foundation for better planning work to get done by meaningfully connecting the city's budget, land use, and strategic planning policies to really get the city to do real planning work and not just rezonings, providing new resources, data, and analyses to support proactive community-based planning in every neighborhood across the city, identifying and prioritizing communities' urgent budget needs, regardless of whether or not those neighborhoods will be rezoned, requiring the city to regularly review and recommend updates to the city's zoning policies in response to the successes, failures, and unintended consequences that the city makes. And finally, forcing coordination across city agencies to better achieve citywide and neighborhood goals. That is my presentation.
Thank you very much. As per the request, are there any individuals from our panel who have any direct questions with regard to the presentation? I don't have everyone here.
Very simple one. Very simple one. Is this?
Sure. Let me first recognize Kevin. Go ahead, please.
Is this PowerPoint going to be made available for viewing for distribution to the members?
I can make a request and see if I can send it around after this meeting. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
I have a question.
Go ahead, please, Susan.
Why isn't the council addressing only the neighborhoods with decades-old need to revamp?
Why
only those?
Oh, it's not at all. That's, again, probably a misunderstanding of the proposal. Every single community district.
I'm sorry. It's not a misunderstanding. It was your presentation.
No, I have another slide here that I can walk you through on the budget reforms.
I don't want to see it.
Okay, well, I will answer your question regardless of whether or not you want me to. The budget reforms really are the most substantive reforms that we are making, which is why it sits in the GovOps committee and not the Land Use Committee. And they are intended to identify and prioritize every single community district's needs, including citywide needs for the city as a whole. It forces the city to work in partnership with communities to actually list and prioritize budget needs, regardless of whether or not the neighborhood is going through a rezoning. I truly believe that every single neighborhood in New York City has longstanding investment needs that have not been addressed. And I'm sure that's true here as well. Community board statements of needs or district statement needs are often not related in the budget process. And so this really would force more transparency and prioritization of those needs in the budget process over time.
Yeah, right.
Steve? We have a question over here.
Steve, this is Maria.
Sure, Maria. We have your picture, but we can't really see you, so I couldn't really tell.
That's okay. Sorry. I like my picture better than the real me. I have a lot of comments, but I have one question. In the presentation, you mentioned there are fine-grained rezoning tools available. What do you mean by fine-grained? I think it was in your first slide or second slide. What are fine-grained rezoning tools if you're telling us you're not rezoning?
So the recommendations here would just inform a land use framework, which would then be used to inform your decisions around rezoning actions in the future. So we literally are not rezoning any neighborhoods. We are not proposing any specific rezoning actions. Fine-grained zoning tools is sort of a plannerly wonky term that's used to describe any tool that's more effective really than the 1961 zoning resolution, which is an extremely blunt tool that encourages a lot of out of context development. It really encourages developers to pull together multiple sites so that they can build as tall a building as possible. And neighborhoods like yours that have gone through rezoning since then have been able to apply contextual rezoning that discourages out of context development. And a lot of neighborhoods that had similar conditions were not given that same treatment. So all this does is essentially create a new pathway for communities all across the city to say, we don't want that skyscraper directly next to this tiny, short 3 to 4 story building and provide an opportunity for them to advocate for new applications of zoning tools that have been applied in other neighborhoods that have been found to be effective to be applied in those neighborhoods. And that's the intent of that bullet there.
Okay, it sounds a little convoluted to me.
Yep.
But I want to hear Paul's presentation before I make some other comments. So I'm going to defer to other questions.
I see Ed Chung has his hand up.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have to tell you, there's a lot of information you throw at us to digest. I just want to say one thing about rezoning. Does the people in the Committee Board 8 decide on our zoning, not the city?
Well, the community board would have the same role in every single ULURP application as it does right now. So it does not give you a binding vote. It really doesn't actually change the ULURP process with that respect at all. But it does provide more resources for you to inform your future decisions. But this proposal, again, it's not actually a proposal for a rezoning of any kind, just to make that very clear.
Do you have to follow up, Ed?
Just want to say bottom line, we live in this neighborhood, and in our neighborhood, we like it the way it is. And we don't want to have developers come in and say, your land is not used properly, we want to build 10-story buildings here.
Right.
Don't the community boards have the final say saying, the total New York City, we like our zone the way it is. We don't want you to touch it.
Yeah.
Go someplace else to build your buildings.
Right, understood.
Can we say that?
You can do that exactly as you do now. I mean, honestly, this neighborhood has gotten a lot of planning attention that is good for the neighborhoods that you are supporting, right? And that makes a lot of sense for this neighborhood in this context. The point of this proposal is that not every neighborhood got that same treatment. A lot of them are just stuck with really, really old zoning code that doesn't make sense for today's development era. And so all this does is create a new opportunity for community boards to inform what will be a proactive land use plan. And that proactive land use plan could say everything should stay exactly the same. That's exactly what it could say. It could say all of the zoning should stay exactly the same. And here are my budget priority needs that you should prioritize in future budget decisions. That would then get sent to the council, which would then adopt a final long-term plan, which again, would not be a rezoning. It would be a future land use map that you could use in your decisions, and applicants would be required to submit a ULURP application that says, I want to build a 10-story building. This does not align with the framework in the long-term plan, but I think it's appropriate anyway. And then you could use that in your deliberations and in talking to council members as they make their final decision to say, this does not align with our final long-term plan.
Thank you.
Wendy?
Yeah.
Wendy,
actually, I'm going to hand my question over to my husband.
I just want to make sure that it's appropriate for me as a council member elect in this forum to ask a question. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
I believe we did invite elected members of the public officials to become panelists so that they could participate and have input into our discussion tonight.
Okay, great. I just, I'm not sworn in yet. I just want to make sure it was okay, but thank you. And Ms. Levers, thank you for your presentation. I'll be sworn into the council on February 16th, so I'm getting a little bit, I'm like jumping the gun a little bit. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of observations. I was the one that created the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability in Law, which is an office that no longer exists. The mayor has split that up into the Office of Sustainability and the Office of Resiliency. But the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, which I created in law, it's my understanding no longer exists as an entity. It's been divided into 2 offices. So I was surprised to see that in the presentation since it does not exist.
Well, it does exist by the charter because we passed it into law. You passed it into law specifically. What they did was just drop the long-term planning from their name, which demonstrates where their priorities lie right now. And so what this would do is reinstate their long-term planning goals. It would significantly expand their responsibilities to really put forth a version of the Plan YC reports, which is in part why that office was created, to really address the full range of tools that the city uses to inform our development and our infrastructure investments, which includes land use and zoning policy in addition to budget recommendations. So it just expands the scope of that work.
Okay, so we'd have to sort of put that office back together again, because when the mayor separated into two separate offices, I didn't think that really, comported with my law, but we'll just hold that aside, and I appreciate that explanation. Second thing that, I can see some of the people on the panel here, seeing this as, in a way, kind of like a, top-down sort of strategy than like a bottom-up sort of strategy. And, as you indicated, this is an area that has been, we have a very active community board. We work very well with the Department of City Planning and with the administration, and the various council members who have represented this area have done, I think, a pretty good job in trying to figure out what the long-term needs of this community are. And I think I'm getting a pretty good read on some of the people who believe that, anything that sort of, smacks of a, top-down kind of process where we at the local level have to conform with something, from that we at the local level have to conform from something with some plan from on high to make sure that we are, in conformance with this overarching thing when we already have the land use resolution of 1961. And we've been able to kind of work with that. And I think there is some, reluctance to creating a whole new paradigm when there's not complete certainty down here at the grassroots as to how that's going to really work for us. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment. You're smarter than I am. You could probably figure out whether that's a question or a comment.
Comment.
A comment. Okay. And then also, I will just say that, with regard to, you made a, reference to irresponsible as of right development. Something that's as of right is by definition as of right. And I think we do, a pretty good job locally of making sure that what the zoning that we have to live by here in this area kind of generally works for us. So anything that's done as of right has been something that pretty much we can all live with. And if we have difficulties with that, we change the zoning to get what it is that we want. And so we feel pretty good about the way things are now, and we're trying to wrap our heads around this new proposal, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, and I totally understand. I think the point about irresponsible as of right development is that there are huge swaths of the city that are stuck with 1961 zoning, and this is not one of those communities. You're right, you have done a really good job of activating, your own planning work in a way that's been really effective and supported your vision for the community. That is not true elsewhere. And so all we're doing is sort of creating an even playing field for every community, really forcing the city's hand, right, to provide resources and engage in a proactive conversation with neighborhoods who have not been touched since 1961 to say, what do you want your futures to look like? What do you like about your neighborhoods? What do you want to preserve? Where do you think, you need investments? Where are the areas? And that would apply here as well. I think we're designed this legislation to be in place for many, many decades to come. And there are going to be a lot of challenges that we face over the next few decades, especially with respect to the climate crisis and unexpected flooding and other types of issues that we've not even yet anticipated, as COVID has shown us, that we really need a proactive citywide vision rooted in community input. And this really does intend to put community boards in a position to make a proactive recommendation for what they want to see. Now, in this neighborhood, that might look like we don't want to change anything. We got our rezoning and it works well for us. And that would be perfectly fine. That would be absolutely allowed under the framework that we've designed. What would this would do is essentially just ensure that every neighborhood is doing the same thing on an ongoing basis, so that we're reviewing and updating our zoning code in a cohesive way. It's something that every other city does. that engages in, every other city that engages in some form of comprehensive planning. That's a key component. Whereas we don't even look back to see what the, implications or impacts of rezonings really were, right? The city is never incentivized to go back and say, hey, we said that this was gonna, produce X number of housing units or Y number of school seats. Whatever happened with that? Like, there's no look back, there's no review to look at impacts, to see what worked really well, to see where there wasn't an unintended consequence. So recently, DCP really did that look back for the first time in Williamsburg and found that the rezoning they did there in 2007 generated thousands more units than what they expected it would. And there was no follow-up. There was no like, oh, okay, we should go back and revisit that. Or, oh, maybe, this neighborhood needs to be treated a little differently because that zoning tool didn't work as well as we thought it would. That was the end of the conversation. And so what this really does is forces the city to proactively review and assess its zoning code in a cohesive way with community input to make recommendations that are rooted in the community's vision for change, while addressing the citywide challenges that we will face with respect to housing, but also the climate crisis specifically.
Okay.
Thank you.
I agree at the moment.
I just want to say that I want to hear from other people on the panel, so I appreciate your comprehensive answer, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so I want to be able to keep the meeting moving along. Currently, we do have 2 people with their hands raised. If everybody knows that you can access the panel at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand, that will be recognized. So we have Maria and Susan, and after we conclude with these 2 next speakers for questions, we'll be moving to Paul Graziano. So Maria, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think there's several misstatements in Annie's presentation. First of all, she congratulates us for the work we've done in our community for zoning, and then talks about other areas that have 1961 zoning codes. But every community in this city has a community board that they can go to make their presence known and their desires known. And just because if those areas are not changing their zoning, it may be number 1, that they're happy with the way they are, or number 2, they agree with the changes that are being made in their community. The problem that I have with Annie's presentation is that she keeps saying that the zoning won't change, but it will change. And it will change because we will go to the city council along with every other community. Well, we'll go to the borough president first, along with every community board in Queens, and put our plans on the table. Once that goes to the city council will look at everything across the city and just pick and choose which ones they want to put in those 3 proposals that are going to go up for vote.
No.
And the bottom line is,
I'm going to stop you there.
No, let her finish, please.
No, I want to say my statement first. The 3 presentations, from what I read in the report, the 3 presentations go to the city council. If they can't get a majority vote to agree, the decision goes to the committee to make that final decision, and you do what you want to do, not what the people locally want to do. So this takes everything out of the local hands, as far as I can see. And I really think that the negative impact will be on community like ours, who have tried very hard for the past 40, 50 years to make sure that our neighborhood stays the neighborhood we live in, the neighborhood we want with the quality of life. Our homes in Queens, we're one of the lowest saturated neighborhoods, but yet there's housing units, multiple housing units all around us, and they are regulated, and we're happy to have them that way. We just don't want people from other communities telling us what needs to be in our neighborhood. And I think that's the big mistake that your whole report is making.
Sure. Okay, I'll start with the 3 scenarios. Actually, no, I'm going to start at a bigger picture than that. Even if you think that whatever ends up in the long-term plan is bad and not good, right? So whatever ends up in the long-term plan, you don't like. So setting aside all of the process that I just described, even if the council adopts a land use plan that you do not agree with, that is still not a rezoning. It does not rezone your neighborhood. It is a lie that it does. Anyone that tells you that it is a rezoning, it's simply not. It is a plan that then future rezoning applications would need to be responsive to. So the ULURP application would include a statement of alignment that simply says whether or not the ULURP application aligns or conflicts with that long-term plan. It would not change any of your current process. It would not automatically impose any of the recommendations in the plan. However, I do want to say that there is a very good chance that you will like what's in the plan, because the process that we've developed and are receiving input on and we'll have a hearing about, and you should come and provide testimony, really is envisioned to allow community boards the flexibility to recommend preferred scenarios of their own. And that is the recommendation that gets sent to the council, not the 3 produced by the city. Those are resources. They could live and die right there. They are suggested as resources to use in their proactive planning efforts, but that is where they end. Community boards could then design preferred scenarios of their very own based on the work that you've already done for many decades, to your point, in this community, send that to the borough president and the city council for consideration, and they would adopt that as a preferred scenario in their final long-term plan. But even then, it is not a rezoning. It's just a framework to measure future rezoning actions against. That is all it is. We are not, it would be irresponsible to force any kind of rezoning citywide on it every 10 years. Like, that is not a best practice in planning. That is too frequent and is likely not necessary. So this would never propose something like that. This provides a framework through which communities can participate in to build a proactive vision for their neighborhoods against which you would measure future rezoning actions. So again, the plan could say change absolutely nothing. And then you would get a ULURP application that says, I want to build something that's not in the current zoning, so I need a rezoning. And it would simply say it does not align with the long-term plan because it doesn't actually fulfill the goals that you designed in the long-term plan. And then you would use that in your deliberations and your recommendations to the council, which would still retain its ability to reject the rezoning application, regardless of whether or not it aligns or conflicts with the plan. So I know it's a lot of process, and it sort of feels like an unnecessary step, perhaps, for especially neighborhoods like yours that really have worked very hard for a long, long time to ensure that you are supporting the development that you want to see in your neighborhood. But it is missing from other neighborhoods. And I think that that's something that you will hear. But this does not require you to listen to those other neighborhoods. This just provides another proactive process for you to participate in and make your vision clear in that planning process.
Okay, and now we have a question from Susan Cleary.
Well, a statement and a question. Miss Annie, you're a very good presenter, and you have really tried very hard to sell the emperor's new clothes. That's my statement. My question is, who are the long-term stakeholders in this whole scenario?
The long-term, like all of the stakeholders, or the long-term planning steering committee?
It mentions in your presentation long-term stakeholders. I want to know specifically who they are.
So it's everyone on this slide. That I sort of walked you through here.
Well, key stakeholders. Okay.
So there is this long-term planning steering committee that I think you might be talking about that will help set citywide goals. That would be, right now the steering committee does exist, and it helps provide input on the Plan YC, 1NYC reports. This would subsume the responsibilities of that long-term planning steering committee, and it would be appointed by a diversity of elected officials, unlike the current steering committee right now, which is only appointed by the mayor.
Whom? I'm sorry, I missed.
It would be a diversity of elected officials. So I'll walk you through what that is.
Exactly.
I'm about to answer your question. So 4 would be appointed by the mayor. 4 would be appointed by the city council speaker, and then each borough president would have 1 appointee. So it's a 13-member body. It would be required to have basically technical experts that would be able to weigh in on issues of sustainability and resilience, parks and open space, schools, housing and infrastructure needs, transportation, et cetera. And they would really look at the full city and say, like, here is the infrastructure that we need to fit into our city over the next 10 years in order to support thriving communities. And that's where that steering committee would actually sort of see their most significant role in this process.
Yeah, great.
All right. Mike, I would ask you to hold off with your question because I said before that we had 2 people we were going to ask questions of, and then we would go to Mr. Graziano to have his presentation. And it's certainly at the conclusion, Mr. Graziano's presentation will open up once again for everyone to have the opportunity to ask questions both to Ms. Levers as well as to Mr. Graziano.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. So, Paul, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me back to Board 8. The first thing I'm going to ask the folks who are attending is, many of you, I believe, have already seen my presentations over the last month. Do I need to show that presentation a third time? And if I don't, I have additional information that I want to bring up, which I submitted to Isabella today.
Well, very briefly, if I could just respond to that point that you're asking about, I think most of the people who are here tonight, certainly from the zoning committee and the community board itself, did see the prior presentation. I'm not sure if everyone from the members of the public, and we do have quite a few, because I see we've got, I think, what do we have, 18 and 43. So clearly there's quite a number of members from the public who may not have seen your entire presentation, although I think that a lot of the material would be available on the community board website. Yeah. Am I correct with that, Isabella? So while we do not need to go through it in great detail, I certainly am not suggesting or in any way handicapping in the presentation that you want to make. So if you want to do some type of summary and added materials, I think that might be a good idea.
I think that's a good way to do it, because rather than reinvent the wheel, let's add to it.
Add another wheel. Go ahead.
Exactly. We need two wheels anyway, right? So thank you again for having me tonight. And just in summary, for those of you who have not heard or seen my presentation, you're welcome to also see it on the full amount on Community Board 8. Certainly, if there are questions that come up, we can refer back to that, the two graphic appendices that were already discussed. But just in a nutshell, let's talk a little bit about this. There's a lot to unpack here, especially after Ms. Lever's presentation tonight. And the first thing I'll say is that when I first examined this back in mid-December, when it was very quietly, both quietly and loudly released, with little fanfare and virtually no outreach to any of the community boards, as I'm the person who's been bringing it to the community boards myself. It was very concerning. I am a planner. I have been doing planning in the city of New York and in the Metropolitan Avenue, sorry, that would be Kew Gardens and Forest Hills, metropolitan area for the last 25 plus years. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a native of Flushing. I am born and bred here. I've lived here almost, well, my entire life, turning 50 in May. So I've been here a fairly long time. And I have written master plans, which have been adopted, award-winning master plans in other parts of the metropolitan area outside of New York City. And yes, the concept of comprehensive planning is generally a good one. Unfortunately, what this proposal and bill is not comprehensive planning in the way that other places do comprehensive planning. So yes, we do not have comprehensive planning in the city of New York, but in my opinion, and I've already brought this forward, what is being proposed here is actually worse than not having comprehensive planning in the city of New York. And let me explain why. When looking at comprehensive planning, we tend to look at all of the different indices, all of the different things that come up. We look at housing, we look at historic resources, we look at open space, we look at transportation, infrastructure, we look at it all. And when you take all of those pieces into consideration in a true planning framework, none of them outweigh the other. They're all weighted at the same level. So, and I'm going to give you an example of that, of one of the places that I have actually done this work. And you can see for yourself what I'm talking about. What I have seen with this document, and again, I've now read the 54-page document several dozen times. I have read the legislation. I'm going to be commenting and going through that very carefully tonight. We did talk about it in our previous meeting, but I'm going to talk about it in depth tonight. And I've also looked at the backing documentation that's being used within the 54-page document, which I believe Ms. Livers was the co-author of. These are all things that are not going to be positive for our communities, and not just our communities, but communities around the city, because by adding an additional layer of bureaucracy, and an additional layer of bureaucracy that I think some people are thinking of some sort of benevolent overlord at the top level. I think that the history of the city and the history of neighborhoods dealing with stuff like this has been quite to the contrary of that. So again, I'll just briefly summarize what I've already brought up, which is, number one, I believe that community boards and elected officials will ultimately lose, not gain, influence over land use and other issues and other agenda issues with this bill, should it be passed. Number two, there is no question, and we will go into the language of the legislation very clearly, as well as the report, that this emphasis on housing above all things is meant to expand housing in the city of New York, not to keep a neighborhood the same, not to protect areas or do anything like that. It is meant to, quote, equitably bring development to the city. And I will use the report and the press releases and the legislation's own language for you to understand this. And as I already have, but I'm going to use it directly. And number three, it could potentially eliminate single family zoning in the city of New York. Typically, when I do a planning study, I don't just look at 2 case studies and come to a conclusion. I look at 10 or 15 or 20 case studies before I pick 6 or 8 or 10 to justify my position. Again, I'm going to go into a little more detail about that this time, but considering the fact, and I've already discussed this in the previous meetings, that single family zoning makes up 15% of the city of New York, not 50, 60, 70, 80, or 85% as most other major cities in the United States have. I am concerned both by the idea of eliminating single family zoning, which the authors in the report seem to think was a very remarkable idea in Minneapolis, and the piecemeal development of or removal of single family and low density contextual zoning for the sake of upzoning our communities, which again, based on the language of this report, the language of the legislation, and the language of the press releases from the Speaker of the City Council, makes it pretty clear. So, as I said, I went into deep detail about this. One of the great concerns that I've also had, and I'm going to bring this up now, but I brought it up and showed graphics in my previous presentations, is the idea that the page 29 of the report, uneven zoning landscape that exacerbates socioeconomic inequality, which has been brought up also in this presentation as one of the points. There are some fundamentally flawed notions that flesh out this document, and in fact, what Ms. Livers was saying in her presentation. So the first thing I'll say is this: the quote that I used in my previous presentation had to do with Mayor Bloomberg famously rezoned roughly 40% of the city's landmass, but failed to address the city's historical neglect of people of color in lower income neighborhoods. Instead, DCP downzoned dozens of neighborhoods in majority white middle income communities in Queens, Staten Island, the Outer Bronx, and Brooklyn, where local civic organizations pressured the city to restrict development. The Bloomberg administration introduced new lower density districts in those wider, wealthier neighborhoods with strict limits on building height and bulk to, quote, protect neighborhood character against overdevelopment. Now, what I presented was an absolutely refuted that statement. And then I went into the 2010 study by the Furman Center, which is quoted heavily in this, on this page and throughout this document as well. As many of you may remember, what I showed in my presentation was that out of the 34 contextual rezonings that were done in Queens between 2005 and 2013, 12 of them were in majority white neighborhoods. And many of those were in majority white neighborhoods where 50% of the population was white and 45% was Asian American or African American, et cetera. So the vast majority of the rezonings were actually not in majority white neighborhoods. They were in across income neighborhoods, working class, middle class, upper middle class, et cetera. And this also tracked in Brooklyn and in the Bronx. This was not anything different. The difference was Queens had the vast majority of these contextual rezonings. When I looked at the Furman Center study, one thing that immediately jumped out at me was the methodology used by the author of that report. What many of you don't know is that the person who wrote that report is Vicki Bean. Vicki Bean wrote this report in 2010. She then became the head of Housing Preservation and Development Commissioner for Mayor de Blasio, and is currently, or was, I believe she still is, the deputy mayor dealing with land use and other issues. Her report, which is again heavily discussed, only looked at the rezonings from 2003 to 2007 in the city, not to 2013. That's the first thing everybody needs to understand. Number two, the methodology was based on the number of lots rezoned. Now, all of us know that when you have a single family or a low density neighborhood, you could have 30 or 40 houses on a block, as opposed to a more densely developed area where you might only have 2 apartment blocks on a block. I describe it like, think of a co-op building that takes up half a city block. That co-op building may have 150 units, but it's only 1 lot. So all lots are not created equal. And so to use this methodology to pinpoint a very false narrative, which is what this is all about, is disturbing to start with. That's why I felt when I showed you these graphics, you had a much better understanding of what actually occurred. And that's why so many people in communities of color that have already seen this understand. They're understandably angry at the way that this is being approached, because they did get rezoned. And there are plenty of neighborhoods that deserve to continue to be rezoned, but this is not the framework for that, in my opinion. So that's, I just want to point that out very clearly. One of the things I'd like to also mention is that this report in the same paragraph describes this methodology and describes how these wider neighborhoods got what they wanted through their rezonings, and then goes on to say that the de Blasio administration ended up angering people through their way of rezoning, which was to only do upzonings in those lower income communities of color. Well, the same person who wrote that report was the same person who did those rezonings for against those communities of color who are low income. So again, to use this argument in the same paragraph and the same page it doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't think it makes sense to those folks who are listening to me. So I think part of the issue here is that the report uses conflicting issues, conflicting things to create a point that is in conflict with itself, number one. Number two, lauds case studies, Seattle being one, where it's very difficult to apply the comprehensive planning in Seattle or any other city to New York City based on A, its size, and B, its complexity, and the fact that we have as of right development in the city of New York, and nobody is going to get rid of that, as much as I personally would prefer that to happen. I actually think as of right development is not very positive for the city of New York. But that is considering the fact that the real estate community has a large lock on politics and influence, which I wrote in my 4-pager, which most of you have read, we know that this is the reality of the situation. And I think that that's part of what we're trying to deal with here is reality. Okay. In addition, the last thing just on this bit here is, as I said, what Ms. Levers has said today sounds great. But I think if you would, Isabella, if you could put up Appendix C for me, I want to go through some of the legislation so that the folks here can read the legislation and understand that it's not quite what Ms. Levers is describing.
Bear with me just one moment.
Sure.
Alrighty.
Thank you. Now this legislation is about 24 pages long, and I distilled a large percentage of it. I didn't distill all 24 pages, but the parts that I thought were important for us to go over tonight. Please go for it. Okay, so there's a lot of writing here. Let's go paragraph by paragraph. Sorry, go back up, please. So the new director of the Office of Long-Term Planning, and just to let you know, this entire legislation was essentially glued on top of a previous piece of legislation from 1991, excuse me. The new director of the Office of Long-Term Planning, who will answer only to the mayor, because the appointment is by the mayor, will submit a draft citywide goals statement with a single public meeting in each borough required. Now I say that because it doesn't mean that it will be the only public meeting, but again, it all depends on who our mayor is, right? It's all great to look at things from a rosy perspective, but I think based on the fact that those of us who don't want another Robert Moses to have that kind of power over the entire city structure, it really depends on who the mayor would be. There could only be one single public meeting in each borough. Okay, this statement, as I said, while giving lip service to those other issues as we were discussing about planning and needs in the city, will focus primarily on housing. And these are some of the quotes. The blue is directly quoted from the document. This is furthered by, quote, determining quantitative community district level targets for each community board, which, quote, shall include, but not limited to, prioritizing population growth where applicable in areas that have high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement, unquote, with limited additional input from borough presidents. A final citywide goal statement will be submitted up to 2.5 months later. So the first piece is approximately, it's a very small amount of time, followed by another 2.5 months, with a single public meeting in each borough required. The final statement, quote, shall include such changes and revisions as the director of the Office of Long-Term Planning deems appropriate. So again, the director decides what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, a single person, after reviewing the comments received on the preliminary citywide goals statement. Once this statement has passed, there will be quantitative community district level targets that the director finds appropriate to include, followed by, quote, 3 potential land use scenarios for accommodating the community district level targets, each of which shall include all applicable proposed future land uses, including but not limited to residential, commercial, industrial, institutions, open space, transportation, utilities with indications for relative height and density. Now that sounds more like planning. Let's go to the next page, please. Next page, please. Scroll down, please. Next one. Next page. Nope. You're way up. Go way up, 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 up. Sorry. Next one. Oh, this is it. Sorry. The 3 potential land use scenarios will be submitted by community boards, borough presidents, and the newly created long-term planning steering committee, or reconstituted. Again, appointed 4 each from the mayor and the city council, 1 from each borough president. Each of the 3 potential land use scenarios shall prioritize 1, areas for population growth where applicable that have high access to opportunity and low risk for displacement, and 2, any other priorities. So again, let's unpack this. Population growth and everything else. Again, at the director's discretion. Infrastructure needs will be cataloged, but by no means will housing targets and subsequent adoption of land use scenarios be reliant on those needs being met. And again, it's a vice versa thing. It's great if infrastructure gets prioritized. We are decades behind on our infrastructure and our needs. We all know this. So that's great, but one is not necessarily going to inform the other. In other words, a rezoning or an upzoning is not going to be incumbent upon infrastructure being improved. And that's part of the issue that we have. Within 1 year of the initiation of the process, the director shall submit to the council, borough presidents, and community boards a draft comprehensive long-term plan. No later than 150 days after the submission, the long-term planning steering committee, applicable borough presidents, and applicable community boards shall each submit to the speaker of the city council a recommended preferred land use scenario for each applicable community district with the possibility of amendments at the council level. Within another 5 months, there will be a hearing at the city council where they will, quote, adopt a single resolution establishing 1 preferred land use scenario for each community district. If the council fails to adopt a preferred land use scenario for each community district by such date, the director shall select preferred land use scenarios, along with a written reply as to why. Now, let's focus a little bit on this. As you see, the community board is giving in one of these 3 scenarios. Okay, who says that that scenario is the one that's going to be adopted by the city council, or if the city council chooses not to do it or can't make a decision on it, that this director will then choose which one they want. There is nothing that forces them to choose the one that the community board wants. Okay, now we get into something where I have I don't know what Ms. Lever's saying, but I'm going to read you this directly from the New York City Council website from the speaker when this was released. Okay. There are 5 major elements. I'm going to read you. District points 3 and 4 on this. Point 1 is strategic policies, which has to do with all of the issues that a planning would be dealing with. 2 has to do with analyzing the city's zoning resolution, recommending for citywide zoning changes and policies for managing the city's waterfront. District 3, here we get to the district level targets again. Developed and adopted by the long-term planning steering committee that would distribute growth, infrastructure, amenities, and services equitably throughout the city. These targets would be required to correct historic disinvestment and prioritize growth in areas identified with low displacement risk and high access to opportunity. 4, community district land use scenarios to accommodate the measurable district level targets described above, including indications of relative height and density. And 5 has to do with the budget needs, okay? Now I wanna read you the next part of this, because this is critical, because this is where I'm not making this up. This is directly from the New York City Council website. Through requirements for ongoing public engagement, the creation of a new diverse and representative decision-making bodies to develop, review, and adopt key elements of the plan, the 10-year planning cycle would integrate and balance citywide comprehensive planning with community-based planning at the neighborhood level. This proposal requires City Council adoption of the comprehensive plan. With council adoption, the comprehensive plan would represent a shared vision for New York City across the council, mayoral agencies, and the New Yorkers that council members represent to fulfill our citywide and neighborhood-specific needs for housing, open space, schools, and other infrastructure. Now pay very close attention to the next part. The final adopted long-term plan would then serve as the foundation for both public and private development decisions. Future land use applications that are consistent with the comprehensive plan would only be subject to a council vote if the council voluntarily calls up the application, thereby incentivizing land use actions that further the implementation of the plan while maintaining mechanisms for review. A mandate that the city complete a generic environmental impact statement for the long-term plan will both further incentivize development consistent with the plan by reducing project costs, which can be redirected into community benefits, while ensuring the city evaluates the impacts of the comprehensive plan's planning and zoning policies. Further development that is deemed consistent with the plan would then only be required to complete supplemental environmental review on the impacts specific to that project. Now, I must tell you, when I see project and I see incentivizing development and the words streamlining, this has nothing to do with protecting neighborhoods. This has to do with creating new potential development. Who's to say who's going to make the decision where new development will be occurring in each community board area? Okay, I want you to keep going forward to the next slide, please. I want to give you a good example of a potential scenario. Please go forward.
All right, just bear with me one moment because the computer freezes.
No worries. There we go. Okay, so this is a map of Community Board 8 with all of the zoning on the map, right? So you see Hillside Avenue, you can see where the subway stops are on the bottom, towards the bottom. Flushing Meadows is on the left-hand side. LIE is on the north, Cunningham Park on the east side, and all the different zoning designations, right? Some of which I designed, as many of you know. So I'm very, very familiar with these communities, even though I'm only from the north side of Flushing, not the south. Keep going, please. Let's say that based on the report that the community board gets from the director, that essentially each of these community boards has to, based on population growth, the population has to be distributed across the city, and also based on schools and all of the other indices, that CB8 has to absorb X amount of units over that 10 years. So CB8 says, okay, you know what? This is probably the best place for growth in our community. This is just north of Hillside Avenue, right by Queens Boulevard. It's an R4-1 zone, which was, of course, rezoned in the Briarwood rezoning, which I helped to design. But this is where we think this is the best location. If that growth is going to happen, keep going to the next slide, please. The next one is the borough president recommends that the area north of Jamaica Hill, which is an R5 zone, should be rezoned because it's right by the Farmers Boulevard station. The other one's near the Sutton Boulevard station. That this would be a great location because it's an R5 zone, and we should upzone it as well because, again, this makes the most sense. This is where the units should go. Next one, please. And the long-term planning steering committee decides that this location in Jamaica Estates, which is an R3X zone, which was rezoned as part of the Jamaica plan, which was a multi-year discussion between multiple community boards, that this is the location where it should happen. Keep going, please. And that the community board, this will go from an R4-1 to an R7A, which is the adjacent zone, R5 to R7A, and R3X to R6A. Well, the council decides that instead of the first two, that the third one should happen, the R3X to R6A. Keep going, please. So this is your current R3X zone. Next, please. And this is your R6A zone. Now, the R3X zone has been identified in this report that it should go to R6A. So what will happen is, if this gets approved, then a developer comes in, next please. And let's say in that little dog leg of the R3X, there are 6 houses there. Let's say the developer buys 3 of them. So he then puts in a rezoning proposal for that piece. Well, it's going to an R6A, so it's aligning with the approved plan. Again, a plan that's approved either by the council or by the director of long-term planning, not by the community board. Once it reaches that goal, and that area now, it doesn't automatically become R6A, it only becomes R6A when someone puts in the application to rezone it. So now that dogleg, the application goes in, and I'll read it again. Future land use applications that are consistent with the comprehensive plan would only be subject to a council vote if the council voluntarily calls up the application. Okay, next one, you'll see, it doesn't get called up because it meets the goals of the long-term plan, the plan that was passed. That's how this works. That is in their own language. Okay, I want to show you all an actual example of comprehensive planning. If you could go to the other document for me, that would be great.
Which one?
Not the one that says 2010, the other one.
I have the master plan or
Yep.
the rezone?
Yep. The master plan. Yep. So in 1998, when I was merely 27 years old, I was the co-author of the Boonton, New Jersey master plan. Boonton has about 8,000 people. It's, if anybody's familiar, it's just north of Morristown. It's about 20 miles west of the George Washington Bridge. It's an old town. It's been around for a couple of 100 years. And we wrote this report and we ended up winning the award for the best master plan, I believe in the state of New Jersey, certainly in Morris County. And when you click on this, you're going to see the discussion, because in New Jersey, they have to update the master plans every 7 years. They have what's called a master plan reexamination, which is part of comprehensive planning. So I'm just waiting for you, Isabel.
Sorry, give me just one moment.
No worries.
Let me just download that because it just doesn't want to show up right.
It's a PDF, so.
Yeah. I guess that's it.
Sorry, folks. Technical difficulties.
Sorry. Where is that?
Excuse me, why doesn't the chat room work?
That's the way the meeting was set by Marie, so I don't know.
Okay.
You can only do the questions and answers for this meeting. Can I just leave it this way and then we can scroll?
Let's concentrate on.
But you have to get rid of the other one, the comprehensive planning one. The one that.
It's a separate document.
Appendix C, just get rid of that.
Sorry, I didn't realize I didn't share the right screen.
There we go. There we go. Thank you.
I've been looking at the, okay.
So let's, actually, can you pull it back to like 75%? I think it's at 80%. So yeah.
That's better?
A little more, sorry.
No, that's okay.
A little more. Yeah, that's good, that's good. So again, so this is now the third re-exam from when I did mine more than 20 years ago, right? So scroll down. What is a master plan? A master plan provides a long-range vision for the built environment of a community. Elements include land use, circulation, economic development, parks and open space, historic preservation, community facilities. And you can see the elements. Where are there suitable locations for commercial housing, mixed-use development? Locations where the town should increase or maintain density, use redevelopment, or intervene in other ways. Opportunities to extend and or improve open space, recreational areas, et cetera. Strategies for increasing economic development, assessment of environmental, historic, and cultural resources that need conservation, and strategies for improving transportation facilities, infrastructure, and services. Keep going, please. And it's a little under a 1-year framework. But again, remember, this is a town of 8,000 people, not a city of 8.1 million. Keep going. Right, so we have stakeholder meetings, various meetings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Keep going. Major themes. The first theme is not about development. It's about how do we make our town a better place for people to come visit? How do we celebrate our history, then development, then quality of life issues, and then how do we protect and maintain and restore appeal of neighborhoods? Character of communities. Sound familiar? Keep going. And by the way, Boonton's a very middle-class town, just to let you know. It's got some working class areas and some wealthier areas, but it's very middle class. So here's some of the things that were being proposed to be changed. Change minimum lot sizes for one particular zone. Take away permitted use for 2-family homes and make it a conditional use. Permit residential units on the upper floors of the commercial district on Main Street. Change a high residential zone to an arts district, like to attract artists, etc. That's land use. Keep going. A future land use map. Keep going. Then they get into circulation, walking, driving, parking, New Jersey Transit. Keep going. Bike routes. I know people in this administration love bikes. Keep going. Economic development actions. How do we make our town better through economic development? Keep going. Parks and open space. How do we create new systems of walking trails and get more, community gardens, et cetera, et cetera. Keep going. New parks. Keep going.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Historic preservation. We want to designate some of this town, which by the way is very historic, some parts of it to enhance our town and to protect these neighborhoods from being demolished, right? So, which is obviously in Queens, we don't have too many areas that are actually landmarked. And I think most of you already know that. Keep going. Right, a map of historic properties, districts, etc. Keep going. Community facilities. How do we deal with community facilities? And those are public. So, again, the conversation about comprehensive plan, this is comprehensive planning, because once they adopt this, every aspect of this plan becomes law. With this, what's being proposed, that isn't what's going to happen. The only thing that's going to become law is actually the change in the process how land use is acted upon, right? There's no checks or balances. There's nothing that says you can't do this if you don't do that. And in fact, what it does, again, from everything that I've read to you, coming from the speaker's own website and their own legislation and their own report, speaks to the opposite of this. So while the concept of comprehensive planning, again, is, you just saw it right there, that is comprehensive planning. That is not what's going on with this report. And while maybe the intent of the writers was different from what came out of it, but what came out of it is absolutely not something I think we should be supporting. And again, I'm not on Community Board 8, but you know my reputation, and I've been here doing work with you guys for a long time. So that's my basic presentation. I'm happy to answer as many questions as you like. Again, you've already seen my other presentation, so this is just on top of that. But I felt, especially after the first speaker said what she said, that some things needed to be clarified. So are there any questions? And you can pull this down now. Thank you.
Yeah, I would ask then just stop sharing the screen there. And if anybody has questions, they can raise their hands in the queue. I see Maria, you got your hand raised?
Actually, that's an old hand raised, so you can take that off.
Okay. Is there anybody else who has any questions either for Paul Graziano or Annie Levers? I don't see anyone raising their hands. I don't see any. Oh, there we go. Okay. Paul De Benedetto?
Yes, thank you. So, Mr. Graziano, I'm just curious. The way that you see it, I mean, this plan, you're not necessarily against the idea of comprehensive planning, but you think that this isn't community minded. This is more of an authoritarian minded plan. Is that true?
Well, I look at this as it's a housing program. You know, it's a housing and development program, which on the face of it, if that's what it is, then that's what it is. But it's not comprehensive planning. It is very top heavy. I think Councilman-elect Gennaro did bring this up, and nice to see you again, Jim, if you're still there. This clearly, again, we already have this tremendous bureaucracy with land use. To place an additional level on top of the level that we have, and to remove the limited power that communities have currently, it's autocratic. Right. Authoritarian, I'm not so sure. That's maybe not the right word, but certainly less participation, not more, and certainly less influence over the process.
Right. I mean, I said authoritarian in the sense that it seems to be driven centrally as opposed to community. I mean, I'd always wish that we'd have more, that the community would have more of an influence in planning as opposed to, although that did happen in 2005. I live in Bayside. In 2005, that did happen where the community was much more involved, that you were at the center of that. So thank you.
Sure. And, you know, again, we talked about this at our previous meetings, Board 8. We got a lot of contextual rezonings. And you know what? Unfortunately, this mayor did not carry the ball that Bloomberg had started, because if he had, another 40% of the city would have been rezoned, contextually rezoned. And that's my belief. But instead it was halted with an agenda that stated, we will never contextually rezone another neighborhood as long as I'm mayor. And he actually stated that, and his administration has kept his word. So this is something that, if that had continued to happen, a lot of our land use issues throughout the entire city would have been dealt with. And unfortunately, only half of it was done. So what I would say to any future mayoral candidate is, hey, you want to help the city? So any other questions?
And just, if I could add one more thing. I'm so,
go ahead, Paul.
So sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you. I just wanted to say that as far as I mean, the zoning that I've studied you know, basically in 1961, the city, you know, finally organized a zoning, you know, citywide zoning, and the city was zoned for growth, and then it didn't really face another major citywide, you know, almost citywide rezoning until the 2000s. So the point being is that the city was zoned for growth in the 60s, and the growth was, I believe, in the year 2000 was, I think you might know the number. What was it?
When Robert Moses and his cohorts came up with the zoning in 1961, they believed that the city was going to have between 16 and 20 million people by the year 2000. And instead, there was about 8 million in 1961. And instead, today we have, well, pre-COVID, because who the heck knows what our population is now. But as of last year, our population actually fell from 8.5 million in 2010 to about 8.1 million in 2019 or 2020. So this begs the question, what's the rush for pushing through this kind of legislation in the middle of the pandemic with a declining population? which is
that's what I was getting at, is that if we built out our zoning entirely, if nothing has changed since 1960 because in the 2000s we had some up zonings, some down zonings. So if nothing changed, we have plenty of room for growth already within the zoning. So why are we looking to do this?
Just to let everybody know, with all of the zoning changes that occurred during the Bloomberg administration, we did increase capacity overall. So even though huge swaths of the city were downzoned or contextually rezoned, there were big areas that were upzoned, like downtown Jamaica, which you guys were involved in, downtown Brooklyn, Hudson Yards, and others. So the capacity didn't go down, it went up. So we didn't lose the ability to develop in the city. This is my point. So other questions? Thank you, Paul.
I think, Mike, you had your hand up earlier and you were waiting until we had Paul's presentation. Do you still have a question?
Yes, I guess my main question is, Paul, and it's really for you, Steve. Are we looking to have a vote on whether to move forward or vote against? Because I think, and I'm just speaking for myself, I think I've heard enough from both sides for us to make a decision on how to move forward, but I'd like to get the take on all the members on the call right now.
All right, no, I appreciate that. For the moment, though, we do have the floor open for anybody who still requires any additional clarifications based upon the two presentations. And I see that we do have Susan Cleary with her hand up.
Once again, sorry. Since our population allegedly has reduced, isn't it always a good idea to plan for the future?
Is that directed to either Paul or Annie?
It's always good to plan for the future, always. But what this is not planning. I think that's the main issue, is planning for the future is what we did in the 2000s. We did plan for the future, and we actually remedied or remediated a whole bunch of issues that needed to be addressed that previous administrations had refused to do. And I think that other neighborhoods should be getting the same treatment. There's no question, but there's a very simple way to do this without creating a process that actually, in my opinion, will be the exact opposite and will backfire terribly, because who the heck knows who's going to be in charge and be the people who can pull those levers that we will have less control over, not more. Does that answer your question, Susan?
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that response?
Sure.
Yes, it did answer my question. And Ms. Levers, do you
Levers? It's Ms. Levers. Thank you.
Do you have any kind of presentation you can send to the community board so we can physically touch it, read it?
Like mail you a physical copy of the presentation that I gave tonight?
Email?
Electronic.
Oh, electronic, yes, of course. I don't have a printer, so I would not personally be able to mail you something for quite a while, but yes, I could email you something. Paul, I just wanted to follow up on that one statement, because I do want to underscore that this is a legislative proposal, and while I don't agree with a lot of the ways that you characterize the report itself, a lot of the ways that you characterize the legislation was also inaccurate. I think you left out a lot of the public participation milestones that we built in. You left out the role of the long-term planning steering committee in setting the citywide goals. But all of that said, this is a legislative process that can go through amendments. And I am just curious to hear if you have proposals for improving this process to make it more in line with what you would see fit, or if you just want to reject it outright, because this is leading up to my actual question. When you say that there are easier ways to get the contextual rezoning tools applied in other neighborhoods that they need, what are those ways, and why haven't we done it over the last 20 years? If it's so easy, why hasn't it gotten done? And don't you see this as an opportunity to apply those tools in other neighborhoods through an ongoing proactive process?
The first thing I'll say is we did get it done. And then we got a new mayor, and the new mayor shut it off. So that's just wrong. Your answer is wrong. We got it done, and had the mayor continued the program.
You got it done in certain neighborhoods. And all the other neighborhoods did not get it.
We got it done across huge swaths of Queens, not just certain neighborhoods. Southeast Queens, you can smile all you want. Southeast Queens, 80% of Southeast Queens was rezoned, 80%. More than 80% of other parts of Queens were rezoned. Huge portions of the Rockaways were rezoned. Big parts of Western and Northwestern Queens were rezoned. And it didn't matter what their population, their demographic, their economics, they got rezoned. And they got rezoned well. And there was an enormous amount of community participation. And again, you can speak to the community board members who are on this Zoom meeting. That some of these rezonings went for a year, some went for 2 years before they were certified. There was a tremendous amount of community input. I personally designed half of the rezonings in Queens. I sat down, I did it for the civic associations first and the community boards first, not the electeds. And the electeds all signed on. So just—
I am aware. And I'm talking about all the other neighborhoods throughout the city that did not go through that process, not in Queens, elsewhere.
As I'm saying, why didn't they go through the process? Because we got a new administration. What's to say, once this framework goes into being, that a new administration doesn't stack the same kind of people or have a different ideology that will make it even more difficult?
So then what is the easier way that you see to get those neighborhoods the rezoning tools they need?
Well, it's not this bill.
Okay, that's fine. But do you have a proposal for improving the legislation?
It's not improving. The legislation doesn't work because it's built on a falsehood. That's the problem. And this is what I've said from the beginning. And frankly, this shouldn't be a debate between the two of us because this is really a community board meeting. But I'll state this very clearly. Your proposal is built on falsehoods. I've already called them out very clearly. You can, again, you can say what you want to say. It's very clear that this is very clear that this is not an accurate portrait of what occurred and what is occurring and what you're proposing. And the fact that I am stating what's written in the legislation, I am not cherry picking the legislation and the writing in the legislation, nor am I cherry picking what is being said on the press release from Corey Johnson when he put this out.
What are you hearing?
I stand by what's in the press release. And you know, I know this is not a debate, so I'll just end it there. And I'm not intending to, you know, I wish that we could have a conversation. I welcome a conversation that you and I could have to talk about this proposal. And I look forward to it. Honestly, this is a legislative process. This is the very beginning of the legislative process. And we're having proactive meetings like these to get input. So I welcome all of that input from Councilmember-elect, as well as you, as well as all members of this community board.
What I recommend is that the council withdraw the bill and start over. That's my recommendation, and actually talk to communities and talk to people outside of your very small group of people that came up with this, as I saw from the people who wrote this report, and actually talk to the communities instead of trying to create a framework that the communities would never come up with, and come up with an idea where I am all for communities deciding their own fate. And I think that this is what the community boards and the civics and the neighborhoods want. They want to be able to make sure that they can do what they want and not have it imposed upon them, particularly in this kind of a framework. So I'm happy to talk to you offline about this, but my recommendation to the community board and other community boards is to reject this legislation. And if the speaker wants to start over with something, he should be reaching out to people prior to introducing something like this, and then only engaging almost 2 months after it's been released into the wild. So that's what I have to say. And I thank you for coming and presenting tonight.
Thank you both. Maria, you do have your hand up. Is there a question?
Yeah, I do now. Thank you, Steve. Annie, most of us have been involved in our civics and in the community for many years. I personally started very young. I've lived here about 50 years and was really intimately involved with our rezoning. Paul did not actually work with us on our rezoning, but we did work very hard on getting ourselves rezoned. I think the misconception with this whole legislation and the speaker's focus is that he took the communities out of the discussion. If you say, what is the plan? I think the mistake was going with a small group without talking to groups that have done this before or organizations that have led groups to help do this. Instead of looking at Queens and saying that community has done great things in rezoning, because we will tell you, as of right is a pain in the neck. We would love to see changes in the things that are getting done. We understand, though, that being realistic, that our political tendency is for largely real estate developers to be able to get their way over local communities. But we've fought that and we've won many, many times. So I think you want a new plan, it's go back to the drawing board, insert the communities so that our input is more than at public hearings, to a steering committee that's appointed to meet their citywide goals and not our community goals, to make our input in the council stronger, because right now we work with our city councilman. Thank God it's Jim Gennaro. He's my city councilman now. We'll be working with him on any issues that are zoning issues or things we'd like to see impacted, not the entire city council as this whole change is going. I don't know how many members have read the 54-page plan, but I did. And I find that many of your comments are rosy responses to details that are in the report that don't say what you're saying in public. And that really bothers me because it's more like you're interpreting what they might do, not what the bill is actually saying they want to do. And, you know, I feel that land use planning should include should include the will of the people. And we've all listened to the MTA and their public hearings, many other public hearings from the city and this mayor. And no matter what the community is screaming in the wings and saying, they vote the way the mayor wants them to vote, or whoever their constituency is, and it's not the people. So you want a revision of this plan? My advice is go back to the drawing board and come and talk to us face to face where we live and find out what would work for us and the rest of the city. And as I said, it looks like we're being beaten up because we worked very hard to keep the quality of life in Queens and our land use under control. I can't talk for other community boards and other communities, but instead of telling us we have to conform because they didn't do what they're supposed to do, you should be telling them, look at Queens and follow their great leadership in redesigning your communities to meet what you want it to be, not what someone on a city planning commission wants it to be. So that's my speech.
Thank you very much, Maria. Kevin, you'll be our final.
Can I just respond to that for one moment?
She didn't really ask a question at the end of the evening.
I know. I
made
just
a statement.
I know. I just want to clarify.
It's getting quite late, so I would ask Kevin, please.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. This is a rhetorical question, but should the city council, at this point in their last year, going out the door with the mayor, be the ones to be making these decisions and making this rather massive legislation, especially since they've had 2 charter revisions that fail to address this issue. Some other brief comments I will try to make. In the whole process, at the beginning of the bill, it talks about a whole series of goals and so on. One of the things that is missing is that there is no words, anything like Paul made this response before, is to the character of the neighborhood. It calls for all sorts of things to be done for social and wonderful things, but it could end up destroying neighborhoods like ours. And the process you spoke about, Annie, why hasn't it continued? Well, we ended up at Community Ward 8 sponsoring a rezoning as an applicant because the city council, or the city planning would not give the staff support to that neighborhood to do a rezoning. That got approved, and it was an upzoning or modified upzoning. To an R2X zone. So the reason that a lot of this planning didn't go, one of the reasons is that there wasn't funding available for it. If you followed the same process, you could have had it. Now, I was involved, and Paul was also in a rezoning in a rather mixed community, 2 communities. And there was very detailed work by the community and by city planning, going building by building and so on, making that analysis. There is no, for anything I've heard so far that you said, I haven't heard that type of interaction between the communities. And unfortunately, in dealing with some of the communities, especially the more economically deprived ones, people are working 2 or 3 jobs, they don't have time to spend in that activity. I personally, my wife was very involved also. We spent hours and hours every week on the Jamaica plan, and we were giving some resources to another area that is very different from ours. I would recommend that we do, the question before, do we take a vote tonight to make a decision? I urgently request that we do so. Thank you.
Yes, okay. As I said, Kevin would be our last gentleman from the board and from the committee tonight to make any comments about it. As often happens, rather than asking questions of either of our presenters tonight, many of our members chose to make statements. Statements generally are held off until after we do have a motion on the floor. So bearing that in mind, that many people have already made their statements, I would call for a motion to support the speaker's plan for planning together.
I so move.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
With the provision, understanding that we always make motions in the positive.
In the positive, absolutely.
There's a big audience.
Okay. Do we have a second, please?
I second.
Michael, thank you very much. Any additional comments with regard to the motion on the floor?
I would strongly oppose the motion for all the reasons that were stated before, and I urge all the voting members oppose and say no.
Yeah. Any other individuals who have any comments? I don't see anyone raising their hand.
Susan.
Myself, I apologize.
Susan had her hand up.
Yeah.
Susan?
One size doesn't fit all.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I myself did have a few observations about the plan as presented, and that was, comparing possible zoning changes or planning for the future that other cities do and saying that New York should follow their lead. I haven't heard any comparisons between what New York City is and what many of these other cities that have followed these types of plannings for their futures are, so that to say that they're comparable, that we should follow them. New York City is really like no other city in this country. There's also a question of how it all budgeting would fit into this picture in terms of all the changes that could be envisioned on a citywide plan, and why would a citywide plan apply to a particular neighborhood as a goal of planning? That wasn't mentioned at all. There were no specific examples given in the beginning. I believe on the first slide is many of the reasons why this was being pushed forward as a citywide plan to now attack this on a citywide basis in order to accomplish these goals. But there were no specific examples of any shortfalling, but as opposed to generalities of where other areas of the city have failed to move themselves forward, as well as there was one slide which one side was all the things that this plan is not going to do. And I think many of us were very happy to see what it is proposed, what is not going to be done by this proposal. But the other side of the slide was all the things which hopefully could be accomplished through this proposal. And my question is, could not many of these other things that are lofty goals, which this proposal seeks to address, could those things not be addressed without an all-encompassing plan, as opposed to much more targeted planning to exactly try to remedy those problems, which this plan would hopefully be able to accomplish? So for all of those reasons, the lack of specificity, the overgeneralization, the wide brush, which with this would cross the entire city, wrap everything into one ball, the failure of having specificity in terms of the deficits that we're trying to attack, and the way in which we could otherwise remedy many of these situations without this all-encompassing plan, I would not be voting in favor of tonight, the proposal for tonight. That being said, are there any other comments with regard to the motion? I don't see any, so I would call for a roll call vote of the members of the zoning committee. Now, I went through the people who are here as well, and I see that we do have 14 members of the zoning committee. 10 of them were in attendance, and currently I believe we only have 9. We have a couple of people who are general members of the community board that will have the opportunity to have their voices heard when this is brought for the full board this coming Wednesday evening, I believe. So Isabella, if you're prepared to call the roll of the zoning committee members.
Yes, just give me one moment.
Of course. And I want to thank both presenters tonight. I think they did a fantastic job. I want to thank everyone from the members of the public who came. We have 23 comments. I think there was Mr. Anonymous and Mr. Neiman were the two who made the most comments, and everybody has seen what those comments were. And I want to thank everyone for their participation tonight.
Steve, could I suggest that you remind people of what the no and yes votes mean?
Well, not a problem at all. The motion was made in the positive, which means that the motion is to approve and endorse the plan as presented by Annie Levers on behalf of Speaker Corey Johnson from the New York City City Council. In favor, if you vote yes, means you are endorsing and you are in favor of planning together as presented. A vote against the motion means that you're not thrilled with what was presented. Maybe you want them to go back and redo it, come up with a different plan. But basically, if you're voting yes on the motion, you're voting in favor of the presentation as made by Ms. Levers. And if you're voting against the motion, you're voting down this plan as presented. Is that clear to everyone? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Dilafraz Ahmed?
No.
Edward Chung?
No.
Susan Cleary?
No.
Kenneth Cohen II? I think he's left. Solomon Davidoff? Solomon Davidoff? No. Okay. Kevin Forrestal?
No.
Michael Hannibal?
No.
Stephen Koenigsberg?
No.
Dilip Nath?
No.
Jesse Rosenbaum?
No.
Okay, so that's everybody.
Doug Sherman?
Is he here?
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh my goodness. Douglas Sherman.
Couldn't hear you, Doug.
Okay.
Trial.
Sorry about that.
Okay. I believe Doug said no.
Yes. That's
okay. I just want to be clear. Howard Fried, a member of the committee, was not here tonight. Rabbi Nissanov, a member of the committee, was not here tonight.
Trial.
That pretty much covers everybody.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you once again for your participation and informing the community on this very important project. And this will be a report to the full committee at its regular monthly meeting, which will take place on Wednesday evening. That makes it the 10th, I'm guessing, right? Today's the 8th, yes. That'll be on the 10th. And there's a Zoom. If you need the Zoom information, you can call into the office or email into the office, 718-264...
7895.
7895. And thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thanks, Isabella.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night, everybody.
Paul, was there something?
Thanks for your help, Isabella.
I will be in attendance on Wednesday, so if anybody needs to ask questions, I'll be there.
Okay. Thank you. It is now 9:27, and we're finished with this evening.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you again. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.